My Life as I Remember It, Chapter 1, Part 1, Anthras, Tennessee. My name is Franklin Delano Payne. My mother was a Democrat and named me after our then President, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I can remember my mother crying when she heard on the radio that President Roosevelt had died. She was a fighting Democrat and would have been shocked to know her son would someday become a strong Republican. And I might add, there's so much to this, I'm just going to read it, so rather than just try to say it from memory. I was born the 16th day of July, 1938, either at home in Anthras, Tennessee, or in the hospital at Jellicoe, Tennessee. My birth certificate lists Jellicoe, but some of the family said I was born at home. For the life of me, I do not know why I never tried to nail this down. When I entered the United States Air Force, I listed Anthras as place of birth on some documents and Jellicoe on others. I have been investigated several times for security clearances, and the question of my place of birth never triggered any negative responses. Either it doesn't mean anything, or the background investigators were sloppy. My dad worked at Oak Ridge during the Second World War, and to save time, they probably looked at his records and the place of birth he gave for me. This probably matched what I was putting down as a birthplace, or they had determined I was not a communist and could be trusted. For this personal history, I will use the hospital in Jellicoe as my place of birth. In 1938, Anthras was a 100% company-owned coal mining camp. The name Anthras came from the name anthracite coal and was given its name by L.I. Coleman, president of the Tennessee Jellicoe Coal Company. Anthras is located on the Clear Fork River in the northeastern portion of Campbell County near Claiborne County. The borderline between the two counties was established in 1909. Anthras as a location still exists, but the last time I checked, only one house remained in that community. The Anthras Baptist Church sits at the intersection of Highway 90 and a dirt road that goes into Anthras. The road into Anthras is used by coal trucks hauling coal to the tipple for loading on the CSX coal train, and when I lived there, the trains were operated under the name Louisville and Nashville L&N. A footnote about Anthras. When I started this history, Jimmy Arnold, a friend of mine, not a close friend, but a friend, owned a truck tipple where strip mine coal was loaded and hauled out by the CSX Railroad. The last time I was up in Anthras, the tipple and train track had been removed, and the only structure standing in Anthras is the Anthras Baptist Church. Jimmy, who owned the tipple and land in that area, we were having lunch one day, and he offered to sell me the upper portion of Anthras for $5,000. So I could have bought my hometown, I guess, for $5,000. It's a ghost town now. The coal mine was located at Tackett Creek, and the railroad and coal tipple were located in Anthras. The Tennessee Jellicoe Coal Company constructed an alpine-type rope bucket line that the locals called a rope line. This rope line carried buckets of coal from the Tackett Creek underground mine to Anthras. I can remember the sights and sounds of those buckets of coal coming down to the tipple in Anthras. The coal was dumped onto large flat pieces of iron called shakers. These shakers contained holes of different diameters and separated the coal into different grades: slack, egg, and block. My Uncle Carson Payne, who died several years ago, was a maintenance person for this rope line. Dad always talked about the problems they encountered with the rope line during the winter months. The contraction of the steel cables during the cold of winter caused the line to break. When this occurred, it would scatter coal all over the hillside. I never witnessed this event, but I saw lots of the aftermath. None of the houses in the community had any plumbing, and we used the bathroom in outhouses. When we moved away from Anthras, it was not my last experience with outhouses. Years later, when we moved to Furnacetown in La Follette, we once again had an outhouse. One of the neighborhood girls who lived on a hill across the street sat on her porch and clocked one of my trips to the outhouse. One day, she approached me and gave me the exact time of my stay in the outhouse. That's one of those unusual events that stay in your memory forever. Water in Anthras came from a community water source operated by a hand-cranked pump. Each house had a metal bucket of water with a dipper, and everybody drank from the same source. You could always see people walking to and from the community water pump carrying buckets of water. I can remember a few trips to the water pump, but nothing else about this part of my life in Anthras stands out in my mind. My earliest memories of life in the mining camp came when I was approximately 3.5 years old. My sister Arlie confirmed this by telling me my age when she associated some of the events she and I could remember together. One day I was standing in a small chair watching the creek when my legs slid through the webbing of the seat. A small nail from an earlier repair attempt on the chair cut a gash up my leg. If I look close, I can still see that scar on my right leg, the lower right leg. Odd as it may sound today, I started smoking during this time. The older kids who smoked gave me cigarettes, and I developed an addiction to nicotine early. I smoked cigarettes several years and did not quit until I was about 47 years old. I was working for Bechtel in Oak Ridge at the time, and after trying to quit several times, I was able to break the habit, cold turkey. Most of my memories of our house and everything else in Anthras is a gray color. Coal dust was everywhere, and I do not think the houses were painted. This is the vision I see when I think about it. If this information is not exact, just remember I am remembering it from a child's perspective. I don't believe our houses were insulated, and during the winter the only warm spot was near a small fireplace located in each room called a grate. We also had a coal-burning cook stove in the kitchen. Coal was an efficient source of fuel, but dirty. I can remember the smell of coal burning and when I smell it now, it propels me back to those winters of my childhood in Anthras. Coal was abundant in the coal mining camp, and I don't think we ever purchased it. Part of the railroad ran behind our house, and when the steam locomotive pushed and shoved the coal cars, coal from the overloaded cars dropped to the ground and lay along the side of the track. We used this coal to heat these company-owned houses. Some of that coal we burned, I am sure, was delivered by the coal company to its employees. Most of the yards were void of vegetation, and anyone who lived during that time can remember people sweeping the yard. This is not a joke. The yards were barren places without vegetation, and anybody that lived back up in that area would know exactly what I'm talking about. Water for baths was heated on the kitchen stove. One day, my sister Betty had a pot of boiling water on the stove, and I was crawling around on the kitchen floor. When she began to move the water, she tripped over me, and the scalding water landed on the back of my neck. I can remember how much it hurt, but I cannot remember anything about recovering from burns. I don't have any scars, mentally or physically, to remind me of that event, so the burns must have not been serious. My father was a mine foreman and 45 years old when I was born. His name was Howard Payne, born August 4th, 1893. Dad started working in the coal mine with his father at the age of 14. He joined the Army during the First World War and worked in the hospital at Kelly Field, San Antonio, Texas. Dad always talked about San Antonio and the Longhorn Saloon. When I joined the Air Force and was attending basic training at Lackland Air Force Base in January of 1956, I received a weekend pass to San Antonio, where I found and visited the Longhorn Saloon. I also went to the Majestic Theater, and the beautiful artwork on the ceiling was the way Dad described it. When Dad was stationed at Kelly Field outside of San Antonio, it was during the 1918 flu epidemic. Dad talked about those terrible times when the flu was ravaging the world. Several people died in the Kelly Hospital, and he always talked about how mortuary space was hard to find. Approximately 500,000 Americans died during this epidemic, and several children were orphaned when both parents died. This was a pandemic, and some communities were almost wiped out by this disease. Dad never contracted the flu during that epidemic, and he died at age 69 in 1962, and it may have been the flu that killed him. They say one of the last things my dad said was, "I would like to have a bowl of hummingbird hearts." Knowing him the way I did, this statement does not surprise me. Our house in Anthras was located near the intersection of Highway 90. Clairfort Creek ran in front of our house, and some of my earlier memories was the creek during floods. People tossed trash into the creek, and most of it collected on the creek bank. During a heavy rain event, the creek would flood and all the junk would wash away. I can visualize to this day all the trash and junk floating down the raging, muddy creek. I stood on the front porch watching the water flowing past our house, moving from my left to my right. You can imagine how shocked I was when I visited Anthras years later, and to my amazement, the creek was flowing from right to left. Why, as a young boy, do I remember the water flowing in the other direction? The day I looked at the creek and discovered this, I laughed out loud. Dad could not remember people's names, so he called everybody Kitty, and everybody called him this nickname. When I went somewhere with my dad, people would see Dad and shout at him, saying, "Hey, Kitty!" Sometimes when he was in a heated conversation, Dad would say, "Christ, Kitty!" Dad's sister Ruby died March 2005. She was the last one of the family to die while I was working on this history. My cousin Lois Pearl was at the funeral, and afterwards, while we were together, she was talking about Dad and mentioned how he would say, "Christ, Kitty." And Lois Pearl's dad was Delbert Payne, my dad's brother. My mother's name was Ruth Jeffress, born April 21st, 1906, and she was 32 when I was born. She lived in the Black Oak community in Jellicoe, Tennessee, and married Dad Christmas Eve, 24 December 1922. I was the last of 5 children. The oldest was Arlie, born July 8, 1928. And then there was James, Jim, born October 21st, 1929. He died in 2004. Next there was Alfred, born September 19th, 1933. Alfred died May 30th, 1934, after recovering from some kind of illness. My brother Jim said Alfred was playing and started feeling bad and died. What caused his death could be explained today, and it could have been Reye's syndrome. But who knows? Betty was born March 26, 1935. And I just noticed that I didn't place Mother's date of death, and I'll do that in when I do part 2 of chapter 1. I'll include that. On Christmas, Santa looked into the window to see if I was being good. It was a scary sight when he came into the house on Christmas Eve carrying a sack of presents. Some of the toys were made in Japan of what we called celluloid, originally the trade name and now the common name of a synthetic plastic. Betty and her friend Harriet Montgomery destroyed some of the toys because we were now at war with Japan.